I think it's early days for everybody. Primarily also because agents wording is slightly tricky. I think it certainly means different things for different people right now. For me, it's all about autonomous agents, wherein you give an agent your credential and it'll do the work for you when you're not around. For a lot of people, it is more like ChatGPT or like a chatbot from the 2019 era, but with more capabilities. I don't think they're solving a net new business problem right now in terms of like how the agents are interacting with the user or how the agents are the value that they're generating. It's not really there yet. But also agents from the 2019 era, the chatbot, sorry, the conversations were very scripted, right? But also the guardrails were very strong. Right now, the guardrails are being tested, which is like, hey, does the agent get into that $1 deal? Is it hallucinating from this information? Or is it making stuff up, right? Like even I saw some numbers, the latest models, there's a hallucination index, which is like how much of that data is hallucinated.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult to actually get the more deterministic side of an output in agents, especially because you have so many different touch points with LLMs and everyone is basically introducing new randomness.
Yeah. Like the non-deterministic side of agents, I'm not a big fan of right now because that doesn't guarantee repeatability by definition. And so it's kind of like, so let's take a step back. Back into early 2010s, I was researching agents with Toyota, right? And we did a full year-long project trying to figure out what the right user experience inside the car for an Siri-like agent would be. And one of the fascinating discoveries that I had from a UX standpoint, I'm not getting into the technology, but we were learning what the user's preferences were. And it turns out the user was like, well, I don't need you to machine learn how much degrees of air temperature do I need, or like the AC temperature do I need? Can't you just remember it? And at that point, it was like very clear, like, hey, from the user experience standpoint, you really don't need too much, you just need that. Is it doing the job right is more important than is it doing something magical. Like the user doesn't care if it's learning or not. The AC temperature was the thing that they last switched on. And so essentially we were like the knob. The competition with AI agent was not like a newer AI agent. It was like the knob. When you get out of the car, you set the temperature to 68 Fahrenheit and you get back into the car, it should be still 68 Fahrenheit. Like that's it, right?
Is this how you like split up in your agent development, the different tasks? Like some tasks are really like completely deterministic. Once they're set once, they are executed like that all the time. And some are more like flexible.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Sorry.
Yeah, so basically when you have like a typical agent, you're doing some planning, then you have a set of tasks,
Yeah.
and then you execute on those.
Yeah.
If you have this set of tasks and one task is basically a repeat task, do you always take it out of memory and just execute the same again? And how do you actually find out whether the task has been done before?
I think this is an architectural difference. I do not think about tasks in that way. It's not like the agent has generated the task automatically and then you're executing it. For me, I think of agents as more of a hierarchical subtask planning. So agent one, the one that you're interacting with, will plan the actions. And then it will in turn call sub agents. Now, those sub agents can be programmed or they can be agentic actions on their own. So, for example, websites, my agent, let's say, needs to get information from a website and then do some analysis on it. But then that website has certain actions and steps, right? So the agent will delegate to another agent, get me this information from this website. And then that is a specialized agent which knows how to browse websites and get information back. Then your agent can do the analysis on top of it. And so it's more like a task hierarchy. And so it's not necessarily a completely one agent does all the planning, right? So your question, it was not more like, do I remember the task? It was more, can we create a structured way of tasks so that when you delegate the agent a task, it is up to that sub agent to decide whether it needs to replan or just use code to execute.
Yeah. And I've seen like a bunch of different implementations. Like some are trying now to have like one planning agents, which is defining the task in there, then execute it strictly. Some are doing like the multi-chat, like complete free form, which I really hate. And some are now also moving into like the land graph area where you predefine all the steps orient like how the human is doing it and then executing those.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think people are discovering how agents work. One thing I haven't seen yet, if the agent is learning itself, which is to what you just mentioned in the previous question. Once it identifies a particular action, can it learn that action so that the next time it doesn't need to plan it out again? Or preferences, right? So a lot of the work becomes like, hey, can you do preference learning for this user so that the next time the user doesn't have to enter the same information again? Things like that. So that I haven't seen too much of yet. I'm hoping that we get to that pretty soon. So this is the fascinating thing, right? Somebody's probably thought like, hey, let me create an AI in there, which is detecting how far Rahul is from the camera and do focus. And then it is doing something, but that's not really what you want. And at the end of the day, I don't need intelligence. I just need my face to show up, not blurred. And that's essentially the whole challenge with agents. If you ever use ChatGPT to write an email or write a document, you'll know how often you have to go back and forth with the agent and say, like, don't use too boisterous language or something like that. Think about like if that agent was to plan, then you'd be like going back and forth about, no, that's not what I want. Don't do this step instead. And that starts becoming like a really big UX challenge, right? So essentially we're boiling down to like, we don't want intelligence. We just want the stuff to work right.
Yeah, and I think you can get it to work right, or it works right once, but in the end, you want to store the settings. Like in this scenario, I want this to happen. And this is something that's really challenging. And also extracting that from unstructured information is a really big problem.
Yeah, but between completely autonomous and absolutely no autonomy, the agent does 100% of the work and you do 100% of the work. The answer is somewhere in the middle. But finding that middle ground is hard because the more you ask the human to give their settings and preferences and all of that, that starts becoming like a chore. The interesting another user experience tidbit I had there was it can be a really intelligent agent which does stuff. But if the adoption requires the user to change their existing flow or existing how they do it, and it is like starting to look a little, oh man, I've spent like 2 hours on this agent, but it's not doing it exactly the way I want it every time, I'm just going to drop on it, right? I'm just going to stop using it because I've just wasted 2 hours and my way works. It's just slow and painful, which is fine.
Yeah. Elicit is a great example for that with their adaptive interfaces they have built, where you basically have agents just doing work for them and they are filling out the information on your site. But this is like one really narrow use case where you actually have like information gathering, information extraction, where it's not so pertinent that it's like real time in the end. And they are like isolated because each agent is working on their own, they're doing their own task and they're reporting back. Once you get into like more complex tasks, it gets really tricky. And this is something you mentioned before, like the UX part of agents. What are like some of the more innovative or more interesting approaches you've seen?
Essentially, if you think about LLMs as a really, really good autocomplete, I think what we saw originally with ChatGPT and Claude and everybody under the hood was they scripted stuff like human says this, agent says this, human says this, agent says what. And the job of the LLM is to autocomplete it, right? So the chat interface is naturally framed into the LLM space or as an LLM problem very easily. So there are two ways of doing things which I really find fascinating. And with my startup, I'm exploring at least one of them. One is workflow. So instead of the chat completions API, which has user says this, agent says this, user says this, agent says this, what if the JSON list represents a steps in the workflow? So if you had a different way of interacting and delegating to the agent or APIs even, can it do the work differently? The second thing which I really want to do, but I haven't really tried out other than one prototype, is changing state. I'm an infrastructure guy at Kubernetes, right? And I like the declarative paradigm, which is you declare what you need to do, and the agent's job is to go figure things out, or the Kubernetes job is to go implement it. So now, if you had a YAML file and gave the agent a task, and the agent's task was to just change one value in that YAML file. So it's basically the agent is changing the state of the configuration. That might change a lot of the way agents are implemented. So coming back to the UX question, which is, are we limiting ourselves with a paradigm which is chat? There might be other paradigms like workflows. There might be other paradigms like state completion, like state changes, which aren't really explored. And maybe later this year we'll see more of it.
Yeah. What are some use cases you see for that, or that you would love to try?
Definitely one of the workflows thing, like we have paying customers to use workflows. And it's essentially a step-by-step capturing of the logic inside the user's head. So once you capture what are the step of actions to perform, the agent can do them repeatedly, even when you're not around. That's the main, I think, the competition for it is RPA, which you've seen like 2022 boom about RPA. And I think that stepwise workflow capturing with I don't know if it's a DAG or if it has for loop. There's some interesting companies out there doing low code Notion kind of options for creating workflows. I think that's an interesting paradigm. So if you had a PDF file and you want to do some analysis on the PDF file as a business analyst or something, can you capture what is the logic in your head as a workflow and do that? That's the knowledge workflows that I'm trying to automate right now. That's super exciting for me. The state change one is, it's almost, I prefer that to chat or workflow, but it's really hard to implement right now. For example, what I'd say is if the UI is powered by a React or Vue.js kind of state, so if the dictionary changes, the UI changes. Great. So we have something that reflects on the UI side. But if I give the agent an action, can it just change the state rather than do stuff? And that changes we go away from chat-based interfaces or flow-based interfaces, and we get into like real web style interfaces. The agent can just have widgets and modules and change stuff there. The second thing is like the declarative paradigm I like, which is I say this is what needs to get done. And then it is the subsystems task of like making sure that state is reached, like Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is not AI, it's programs, but it is a system that when you define what your YAML files look like, it gets the stuff done. So why not declare to an agent, this is what the output looks like, or this is what the outcome looks like. And then it's that agent's job to go and find out what to do. I really feel like that might just change a lot of how delegation works rather than chat. And I think that creates like these network of multiple agents who can actually successfully talk to each other, because one agent can just delegate and get the work done.
Yeah. And how do you yourself use them privately? Do you have any interesting use cases as well beyond?
How do I use what?
Agents privately.
Two things. One is obviously ChatGPT or Gemini I use for search. ChatGPT I use for like drafting my LinkedIn posts and so on, right? But I'm not yet using these tools to do automated tasks. I think one of the interesting things I've realized is every time I have to use ChatGPT, I have to prime it with instructions. Like, keep this language professional. Don't use too boisterous words, blah, blah, blah. And now if I have to write a blog, which needs to be more insightful, then I have to prime it with other things. And every time I do it, I have to prime it with those instructions, right? So the way I'm using workflows instead is I have a workflow that is like, I'll say like, this is my release state. This is my release. This is the actions that we performed in this release. And it creates a nice little change log for me in my style or in the way that I really like it. And then I just post it on LinkedIn, and nobody's complained about my change logs being AI generated, but it works. And so for privately, I'm just starting to dog food some of the work I've been working on to do the same things again and again, but in a much more optimized way, so that it's also consistent output, right? That's how I'm privately using it.
So it seems like you're giving like really specific tasks over to the agent, which you're judging and then taking their output further.
Yeah.
Do you think that is and will be the recipe for success in building agent applications?
I think and this is the thesis with the startup as well, which is the gap between the human and the agent is larger than the gap between the agent and the tools. Most of the focus in San Francisco, say, or anywhere, people who are building agents are talking about how do we interact with tools, how do we plan stuff out, right? I think my thing that I really want to solve is the magic is happening inside the user's head. How do you capture that logic? So to your question, I think that's where the next frontier is. I want to almost solve that problem. How do I capture what's in the user's head and not onto the workflow itself?
And that's a really interesting challenge. I listened to a podcast of the founder of UiPath, and what they're basically doing is they're sending consultants in the end to the enterprise, which shadow the different employees where they want to do some workflow automations.
I totally agree, 100%. My conversations look like that all the time, which is like, hey, can you show me how do you do this work right now? I don't even ask them to explain to me how they do the work. I ask them to show me, because then it's obvious like what the frustrations are. It's obvious like what the challenges are in the UX. And you also know like how they prefer to do the job. So then you come back and say, oh, can we create a system which captures their workflow really well?
Yeah. And in the end, often people, or especially experts, they are missing some steps if they have to write it down. Basically, what are they doing? Because it's just second nature to them at some point.
And there's a lot, like, again, the context is all in the user's head. The moment it leaves the user's head and on paper or on canvas on a Notion like document, it's already lost a bunch of information. So how do I capture those workflows and be able to, like, one of the interesting things was some of the people who are building agents right now have a template library on their website, and you can start using the templates, right? And I was like, you know what, let me go one step forward. Why don't, instead of creating a template library, let me have users type in what they want to do and it generates the tasks automatically. Turns out none of these tasks are actually on point, because they've been trained on data which doesn't complete all the information about why users do their workflows in a certain way. And so essentially, if the workflows themselves are never captured correctly, you're never going to train an LLM to plan it in the same way.
Yeah. And I think that's a little bit of a bias we coders have, because so much of coding, there is so many resources out there which formalize the workflows we have in coding. And for most industries, especially if you go through training to perform them, this is what's lacking.
Which is why, like, instead of me creating workflows for people, I want to empower people to create their own workflows and use agents much more easily, be able to capture what is in the logic in their head onto that canvas and be able to do that.
Do you think we will get there, that we can do screen monitoring of how he is performing certain actions on the screen to then formalize them and turn them into an agent?
I think there's some companies who are doing that already, like, show us how you do the task and we'll do a screen recording. Then from the screen recording, use an LLM to explore like, hey, this is how this task was done. But that doesn't capture what the user was thinking when they're doing those actions. So it's almost like a decision-making process wherein as a human, you're observing something in your mind, you're making a decision, and then you're performing the action. Now, if you only capture the action, you are only capturing the observable observation and the action. You're not capturing what the decision making is. You can go horribly wrong with that decision making. You can conjecture a lot of things which weren't in the user's head. I mean, maybe the user wasn't trying to pick the right technology. Maybe the user was just like, hey, can I clock out faster today? Right? There's a lot of stuff that's unsaid that is really, really hard to get. And I think that's the next frontier. I almost feel like, yes, we are doing this AGI route and we are doing technology improvement and we are integrating tools. You and I briefly talked about website browsing and how that can be brought in. And that's great. But then between short of Neuralink and something else, we need a way in which the user can effectively convey to the agent what they really want the job to be done.
Yeah. And we already talked a little bit about how that you're taking agents into production. Like, what are the tricks and hacks you've learned over the time, how to actually get beyond the notebook with agents?
Since 2010, I've worked on some sort of agents or the other, except for one job where I just worked on infrastructure. And so both on the research side of agents as well as infrastructure side, now my focus is more on how do I effectively deploy agents that can run in the cloud when I'm not in front of the laptop. And I think that's not much explored by people. I think a lot of the agents are working on the desktop machine when you're in front of the laptop and run on the laptop when you're in front of it. And I don't think that necessarily is going to be the case moving forward. So that's the technology challenge, which is how do we have infrastructure in the cloud, which allows for agents to run with my credentials when I'm not around in a way that it makes the same decisions that I would make. It's a funny anecdote example that I give, which is like, let's say 10 years down the line, I had an agent which was running my business for me. And I go and tell the agent, like, you know what, we need to save 40% money. And I go home, I come back the next day and I ask it like, hey, the agent is like, oh, great, I saved you 50% money. I'm like, awesome, what did you do? Like, oh, I just let go half the team. And I'm like, no, that's not the way I would have made the decision, or at least be able to explain to me, why did you lay off half the team, right? And again, this is a very hypothetical example, but that's the challenge you're going to get into, which is the agent is going to do actions on your behalf when you're not around. And then you're going to have to come back and ask it, like, explain to me why you did it. Maybe I didn't prefer it that way. Why did you do it? And then be able to justify it in a business sense way, right? Like, those are kind of like the fascinating angles of all of this.
Yeah, and this comes again in like the degree of autonomy you want the agent to have, whether you want the final sign off to be done by a human or whether you give them full autonomy.
Yeah, and the human in the loop comes often, like topic comes often. I think back a few years ago, human in the loop referred to somebody halfway around the world complete the task or make the decision for you. I think now human in the loop refers to being able to go back to the user and saying, well, I'm stuck. Can you help unblock me with this decision, right? And it's fascinating. So when you're, let's say the agent is doing work when you're sleeping, and then it gets into some challenge and it needs to come back to you and ask you for feedback. Is it going to send you a text message? Is it going to wait for you to wake up and unblock it? Like, how does it communicate when you're not even there? Like, forget sleeping. Like, maybe you're in a meeting, you're in a half an hour meeting. The agent that has been running needs some input from you. Is it going to show up on your Apple Watch or whatever it is to just unblock the agent? Like, how does the agent come back to you when you're not in front of the laptop? I think that's the challenge is going to be, or the UX side of like communication of human in the loop, not just, yeah, what do you show when the user is already there? That's easy. You can ask the user a question, the user might enter input. But if the user is not there, what do you do?
Yeah. And especially like with the latency, like with agents, this will be something that everything runs async. And if you keep the human in the loop, there has to be like some feedback mechanism. And especially for longer running tests, this will be really interesting.
Yeah, I've actually we already have the user's email when you log in. So one of the ideas was as soon as a workflow is completed or there is a place where we need some more guidance from the user, like, hey, is this the right way to do it? We can send an email out to the user and say, hey, this is what your workflow ran successfully. This is what the output was, and get some feedback there. And I think like being able to reach out to the user and collect that information should be super interesting.
Yeah. And when we are coming to the like more technical parts, how do you at the moment do especially like the cost control of agents? Because that's for me also a major issue, like limiting the context window, limiting long-winded interactions in multi-agents, but also choosing like the adequate model for the task or the least costly but most powerful.
I have some numbers, right? Which is there was a user who almost always preferred pro model to a faster model because it was accurate. They didn't care about the price or the cost or the speed. They said like when the first priority is the information you give me back should be correct. Then we can talk about speed and price, right? But as an outcome, what we were doing was their PDF file or their content was fed in directly all 100,000 tokens in as the input for the workflow or the LLM. And if you have like 5 steps, imagine like 100,000 tokens, first step, 100,000 tokens, 2 steps, 100,000 tokens, and the output of the first 2 steps into the third step. So you're getting into an O of n square times 100,000 tokens kind of costing users of tokens. And so in one afternoon, that user ran a bill of $200 on one of the pro models. Now, the faster model, 10x cheaper, but it didn't give the right results. So now the question is, even when you're giving instructions to the agent, is there a dev mode, quote unquote, dev mode, where you're using a cheaper model to program the agent? And then when it's ready to fly, give it a pro model and say, okay, now you can do the task since I've given you all the instructions well.
Yeah. I always like the like doctor versus e-commerce task for deciding on use cases. Basically e-commerce where there's a really high frequency, or like the doctor where you have like a really high value profession, which you basically like to take over because their time is worth the most. Do you have some decision criteria for agents where they are a great fit for projects, problems, use cases?
Let's look at where the value is at. Like the things that don't need exactly correct information are not super high value in the first place. So for example, me creating marketing for the company, it doesn't matter if the wording is in one way versus the other way. Sure, I have an opinion, but after a certain point, I'm not choosing which exact word comes after which exact word. But if it is like financial analysis and I'm going to make a business decision, which is probably going to be in the millions of dollars affected by it, I don't want it to be able to give me flexible stuff. Be correct about it. And even if I run it again, it needs to be the same thing. So for me, I think there are use cases where you might be fine with like a lower accuracy, but at the end, it's all about, is it sufficient enough accuracy? And I think for some tasks, you really need precise answers because the downstream repercussions of making a wrong, off by 1 0 is a huge monetary impact for somebody, right?
Are there some things already being developed that you think that will help increase the accuracy of especially like LLM-based agents?
So the perceived accuracy is definitely can be improved with guardrails, right? So you can definitely perceive like, hey, the LLM generated a false output, but the guardrails prevent that output to be shown to the user. So the user perceives that the agent is more accurate. That is work being done already. I think in general, making sure that the agent is providing more accurate results is a matter of time, where we had 2000 token windows and now we have million token windows. But then now we have a needle in the haystack problem, wherein where is the information at? And I think the LLM companies are actively trying to solve that right now. So the accuracy should be improved for sure.
Yeah. And do you think agents need a different programming platform? Because I'm talking to a lot of people that actually say like Python is really unsuitable and something like Elixir is more suited for agent type workflows.
It's an interesting phrasing, right? I think as a Python developer, I prefer Python, or I might prefer Node.js if I'm a React developer, right? Does that actually change what the agent does? No. Does that actually change the user expectation of the agent? No. What it changes is how fast can I build it out and how fast can it run? In most cases, we are going to be compute bound or IO bound. So it doesn't really matter if you're using Python or Rust or something like that in the agent language itself. But if it's a on-device agent, then definitely you need to be like closer to C or compiled code as you can, right? I think that's where you need, like Olama is a great example. They've done some really phenomenal optimizations to make it work on a laptop. I think that definitely you wouldn't want Python to be that. But maybe Python is a wrapper towards Olama, and then you can start using that, right?
Yeah. And I think AI or data is a little bit of a game of earned knowledge. So you only learn how to correctly set up stuff over many different projects and many different failures. Well, like the little tricks and hacks you've picked up in your past projects in Cox and Moments that you now use in your current agent implementations.
Just for the audience, Cogs and Moments were two projects that I did last year. One was part of a hackathon with some amazing people and we won that hackathon. So that was the Moments one. The Cogs was later last year. I'll go into Cogs because it's a fascinating way of thinking about things. So most people are thinking about multi-agent, using each agent a prompt, and then they have a personality. The way I thought about it was it's not multi-agents, it's multiple perspectives or processes inside the same agent. So one is the prompt, which helps you converse with the user. The second one is the reflection loop, which is reflecting on what you are saying. And the third one is an improvement loop, which is taking the feedback of the reflection and then improving the prompt so that the next time the prompt improves. And so if you can imagine, these are three kind of cogs that are turning in the brain of the agent, and that's why the name cogs. I think architecturally speaking, there were some learnings there of how to implement multiple agents and things like that. But the most fascinating thing I learned there was feedback. Like people talk about prompt fine tuning, and they don't mean fine tuning the LLM, they mean changing the wording in the prompt. And so something like this could be effectively used to improve the prompt or improve the instructions. So one of the things that I've started putting in some of my agents that I build is something called a flywheel, which is basically you give it an instruction, it gives you an output. And instead of just giving it thumbs down, along with the thumbs down, you give it feedback on why did this prompt not generate the right answer. Then the first thing the agent does is improves the prompt, and then it executes the prompt again. So on ChatGPT kind of agents, you have a retry button, which lets you regenerate the output. And that's great. But if you don't give it the feedback of why do you need it to be regenerated, your prompt wouldn't improve, the agent wouldn't improve its behavior. And so I think that flywheel is a fascinating learning that I had from Cogs, which now is part of some of the agents that I built.
And I assume you're using LLMs to edit the prompts. Are you using some targeted editing where you actually try to identify the part of the prompts which could cause the issue and only edit that part? Or are you just basically feeding in the entire prompt and saying, like, this is the issue, improve it?
So for Cogs, it was the entire prompt and it didn't work well. But for Flywheel, for the workflows, we are just changing one prompt in one step. Because the hypothesis there is the user dislikes the output generated by one step. When the user gives feedback, you change the instruction for that step. There's something to be said about like the user just giving general feedback and the entire workflow is updated. But prompts, being able to change prompts, we haven't really nailed it yet. I don't think it's a solved problem that you can just deploy in production. I would hold on to it for now.
Yeah, my thesis, I tried APO and APE, so automatic prompt optimization from Microsoft, and automatic prompt engineering. I'm not sure which research institute it was. And it was kind of flunky, especially in the outputs. Like if you manually investigate the prompts, how they changed it, it's really weird.
I think Claude came up with something similar, right? Anthropic came out with something similar, or there's a couple of other prompt improvement things. I think in general, people don't know how to phrase English in a way that the agent will give you the same output every time. And I think that's where this whole need comes from. The other idea I had, which we kind of rejected from a UX perspective, is if you can highlight what part of the prompt needs to change, or this instruction doesn't work, and then give it feedback, or somewhere in the prompt, you are able to right click and say, this is the place which I think is the problem. So point out to the agent what needs to change and with what feedback. I think that was fascinating at first, or that's what we wanted to build at first. But then if the hypothesis is that the user doesn't know how to phrase the right prompt, then they don't know how to debug the prompt as well. And so essentially you're just like, great, can you give me some feedback on the step itself? Or can you break down the prompt into different sections? And at least for one section, give me some feedback. So that section is improved.
And looking at your tech stack with what you're developing, what is like your dream tech stack for implementing agents? Like what libraries, tools, services really stick out?
So my focus is on agents running in the enterprise. The idea is that AI Hero will run into customers' cloud. It will use the functions for the customers or their internal microservices and so on. So, and with the authentication privileges that the user, or RBAC that the user has. So that's kind of like an enterprise-y angle. And in order to do this, the system needs to work on different clouds. So naturally, it's running on top of Kubernetes. There's cluster autoscaler that we've already got into place, which helps you scale tasks to as many as you want. Each time you want to run a workflow, it spins up a pod and it just works magically. So that's the underlying infrastructure layer. On top of it is the platform layer, which allows you to deploy this in the customer's cloud. And we can let anybody define the functions or the steps the agent can touch. So for example, with the website thing that we talked about, right? Instead of the user saying something and the agent going and browsing the website completely ad hoc, what if there's an intermediate language that the agent has to report into? And now that we are ensured that these are not like random Python code that is generated and executed. It is a very guided way of implementing things. And then the other part is OAuth seems to be a really cool way of delegating access. We've been using OAuth for like ages, right? But I think here OAuth helps the workflow get privileges and run it on behalf of the user, such that if we both had the same workflow and I have access to a document, but you don't, the workflow should run for me and should not run for you. I think those real challenges in the enterprise world is where the focus is at. Not necessarily like, hey, can we Python generate and can we execute Python in a sandbox? It is great, that's definitely true, but no enterprise would let me generate code and run it ad hoc in their cloud for now, unless it's, sandboxing helps, but then there's limitations to what it can do.
Yeah. And what is something that you would love to see built in the agents field that would make your life way easier?
I like the state, the paradigm that I talked about, which is the three paradigms, right? It's the chat, the workflow, and the state. I think the declarative way of doing things, I would love to see being developed, because essentially, if you have, let's say, a YAML file and you give agent like, hey, this is the feedback or this is the change I want, it needs to go and identify which one field to change. It's a very different way. So the output is not just a new YAML file. It's going back and actually editing the YAML file somehow or changing the state of that. And once that, I think, happens, I think we'll see a lot more way of agents working together or being able to delegate to each other. I think that's what is exciting and I'd love to see being built.
Yeah. And what's next for you? What can you already tease on what you're building right now? What is coming out in the near future?
It's nothing super sexy. It is more functionality though. So what we're doing is being able to scale up to 10,000 workflows at the same time with this and being able to call it. And so these workflows now need to run at the same time with the user's credentials. And they also need to report back when there is a failure and so on. So making the system more scalable is something that we are working on under the hood for AI Hero. And that's going to be fascinating because it not just runs fast enough, but even when you're not there, it is running 100% and giving you the result that you want. That's the exciting part.
And if people want to get in touch with you or start trying out the stuff you just mentioned, where would you point them?
Yeah, so if you want to just see what kind of agents I've been building, it's at aihero.studio. There's demo videos, there's stuff to learn more. But if you have a workflow and you're trying to capture it and execute it, I'd love to compare notes. I'm not trying to sell you anything, but I'd love to just see what you guys are doing and how you think about workflows and automation. And maybe there's something there wherein AI Hero can collaborate with another agent and be able to delegate and have an expert agent, so to speak, to do stuff. So looking for partners and looking for people to build real scalable workflows.
Yeah. And where can people best get in touch with you?
I am active on LinkedIn, so feel free to follow or reach out. And definitely when you reach out or connect, add a note on why we should connect. That just helps me context on how do we know each other, or how it's an amazing podcast that Nicolay has. So like you can just say, hey, I heard you call for action on the podcast. That's why I'm reaching out. Great. Let's talk.